Well, howdy, folks. When we last left your heroes, World War II got kickstarted with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and off to war we went, and it didn't go well. The Japanese kind of kicked their faces in for about a year, but then Battle of Midway, dramatic reversal of fortune as we sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in one engagement, and the Japanese Navy never really recovers from that for the duration of the war. So we'll go back and look at how the war with Japan wraps up after we go visit Europe for a little while. But before we even go to Europe, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening at the home front. One thing that is important at home, the home front of World War II is very similar to the home front of World War One. If you remember in World War One, it was very much a total war. The entire war effort, the war effort affected civilians in a profound way. Most of you guys are of the age where you have literally never been alive during true American peacetime. Now, you probably will be technically peacetime soon because our numbers in Afghanistan are really low and they're supposed to be coming home next year, potentially. But we've had troops in Afghanistan since before many of you were born. And then we had, and this was at a time where the numbers in Afghanistan were a lot higher. And we had a second front going on, a second war going on in Iraq simultaneously. So, and yet, if you don't have a military family, you don't watch the news, you may have never noticed, you're still going about your life in peace and prosperity and things are kind of as normal. That's not the way it was in these days. In World War One and in World War II, if you weren't at war, you were still going to feel the war because first off, a ton of the able-bodied men were either drafted or volunteered, and then from there, it was such an all-hands-on-deck situation that they basically shut down most consumer production during World War II. They made very few consumer goods. You didn't have many cars being built. You didn't have many refrigerators being built. The most factories in America were, semi-forcibly. It was kind of they were encouraged to do it, but if they didn't, they could move past encouragement. And they were kind of seized and turned into bomb making, airplane making, gun making, just whatever they needed for the war effort. Actually, you see some echoes of this in some. There's been some discussion about whether we wound up not having a need to, but there's been some discussion about whether we should have to, seize factories to make masks and ventilators during this whole coronavirus thing. So that's a little bit of the same emergency legal authorities and so forth that would have been used during World War II. I don't think that's actually happened, but there was a discussion about that for a while. So a lot of our factories and stuff like that are converted to military production, and there's an awful lot of things that were rationed very severely. They really limited how much you could use them on the home front. I know in music history, there's this like weird little gap where there's like 4 years where there were almost no records made because there was some kind of chemical that was used in making the vinyl record that they needed for something for conveyor belts in the war or something like that. And so, so you have just kind of a disappearance of a lot of like the entertainment industry, major parts of it. Film was kind of rare in those times because just there's 100 little things that you can buy. A lot of things you just straight up couldn't purchase. Some states so wanted to restrict people's travel so as to save gas that they set a statewide speed limit of 35 miles an hour. So that someone would really want to have to go somewhere to push through that. If you have a nationwide speed limit of 35, I mean that's insane, or a statewide anyway. Once again, people were encouraged to grow their own food. Most of the meat and stuff, I mean, they really took a lot of the agricultural capacity was aimed at feeding troops. Interesting, a couple interesting things about the way that people provided for troops. One, the M&M actually is exists because of World War II. The whole candy coating, the chocolate shell around the M&M was created. They wanted to find a way to be able to send soldiers chocolate, but the problem was it always would melt in the mess. So they actually created the M&M shell as a way to get chocolate to soldiers. If you notice, everyone of that whole generation smoked, unless you're like, have like very strong religious convictions against it. Almost everyone of that age smoked. The reason for that was because the government just gave away cigarettes at high amounts to soldiers during that time and got the whole nation basically hooked on it. But most products were geared towards being made for the war effort, not for domestic consumption. And so once again, similar to Wilson's war socialism, you kind of have this major commandeering of the economy by the Roosevelt administration. He started, the WPB, the War Production Board, which managed all of this sort of stuff. Excuse me. So a lot of rations, Louise. One thing that happens, we talked about this happened a little bit in World War One, but it really happens in a permanent and lasting way after World War Two. Because there were so few men to run factories, a tremendous number of women got jobs working in factories. And you may have seen the symbol of Rosie the Riveter, who was kind of like an icon of the female factory worker or whatever in American propaganda posters. Similar to Uncle Sam saying "I want you" and stuff like that. You had this female figure called Rosie the Riveter that was kind of like encouraging women to go work in the factories. This is a major social change because what happens is it started as a temporary thing, but unlike after World War I, where a lot of people went back to just being housewives and so forth, a tremendous number of people of women actually stay in the workforce at the end of World War II. So this causes like a major shift in like American social patterns, where you have a lot more women working and stuff after World War II than you do before. There were pretty severe tax increases that go down in World War II. Paying for the war was going to be a problem. Remember, World War II in some ways is actually going to bring us out of the Great Depression because, employment gets really high because the Army is paying a lot of people, right? And then not only that, but stepping up production in these factories that, you've got a factory that's making these commercial products to a group of people that is mostly broke and unable to afford them, and now they're making bombs that the Army is buying and using. So, so the World War II in a weird way really was good for the economy. But nonetheless, it took a lot to pay for it. So we ran a pretty high deficit in national debt through World War II, despite having passed pretty significant tax increases. One thing you'll notice is that the practice of withholding tax, where the government, where you don't get paid your full paycheck at a time. Back in the old days, your employer paid you your full paycheck, and then when it was time to do your taxes, you paid all the money at once, and you watched all that money leave. But the problem was, they only got that money once a year in this huge thing, and the government didn't have the kind of cash flow they needed to keep buying goods throughout the year. So they made it to where they actually hold your taxes from you, so you don't get your full paycheck up front. And this is the practice where people, file for their taxes, and sometimes they'll get a refund, sometimes they have to add a little extra, or whatever. But that whole process comes from that. I don't like the withholding tax because I feel like if people watch their whole yearly tax disappear at once, they'd never vote for a Democrat again. But anyway, so you have you have a very involved home front, and you also have more women going into. I forgot to mention this when we talked about women working in the factories. You also have more women going into the armed services than ever had been before. The Women's Army Corps and the WAVES program, which was connected to the Navy, enlisted quite a few, tens of thousands women, which they didn't serve in combat roles. That wasn't legal until just a couple of years ago, which incidentally is, well, I'll hold my tongue on that. That's insane. But anyway, they were able to serve a number of roles within the armed services. So we'll talk today about the war up to the Normandy invasion, and we'll save that one for the next video. So meanwhile, 1942, Hitler really had, made a pretty dumb mistake on his part by, invading the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the, defeat at Stalingrad over in the Eastern Front, over in, the frozen side of things, is going to be one of the decisive turning points of the war. But the other decisive turning point is going to come come in the East, with the invasion of Normandy in France. But before we get there, the first place American troops land over there is actually in North Africa. And the reason they were getting involved in North Africa, well, oil had a bit to do with it, because there's a lot of oil fields out there. But also, if you remember, Italy had tried to avenge a loss in a 19th century war by attacking and trying to seize Ethiopia. Italy then got a little more adventurous, tried to take a little bit more African territory, but they got themselves in. They really were not a very effective ally for the Germans. The Germans spent more time bailing the Italians out than fighting, than really getting aid from them. So ultimately, though, battle had started to go down in the North African desert, and it was largely fought over the control of oil supply. And in charge of the British was a fellow by the name of Bernard Montgomery, who was fairly well thought of. And then in charge of the Germans was the so-called Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, who's probably the greatest German general of the war. Now, this is not to make him out to be a good guy by any means, because he still, bottom line, was fighting for Nazi conquest, but he eventually wound up kind of turning against Hitler, thinking that he was, being bad for the country and was going to cost Germany the war as he started to make, more and more erratic decisions. And so Rommel actually takes part in a conspiracy against Hitler and winds up committing suicide by cyanide pill in exchange for kind of sparing his family's life, if I recall correctly. But Rommel was a tank commander. So he was in charge of one of these panzer divisions that were so highly thought of. He had he had a pretty good command of this kind of new, really mobile style of war built around tanks. And he was kind of befuddling the British. And so the first place American troops land is here in the midst of this situation, to help in operation called Operation Torch. So, November 8th, 1942, Operation Torch is put under the command of a man by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who ultimately is made the Supreme Allied Commander. So, Dwight D. Eisenhower is an American general, is going to become head of the entire Allied force. In World War I, it was a French general, Foch, that had that position, but in World War II, the American Eisenhower is going to take the lead. And Eisenhower, when the war is over, is eventually going to become the president of the United States. And so Eisenhower is probably one of the most well-regarded men of his generation. Is strongly considered an American hero. But so Eisenhower is in charge. They land troops on the coast of Africa at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Of course, Casablanca, one of the great old movies of all time. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall. So in a 3-day advance, the American tanks begin to move toward Tunisia. And eventually we get the Germans and Italians kind of caught in the middle. May of 43, the last German outpost in the city of Tunis in Tunisia collapses. And from there, while the war is raging, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the French resistance, met in Casablanca, which is an African city that had been part of the French Empire at one point. in what's now Algeria, to forge a strategy. Ultimately, Stalin had been invited, but he wasn't there because he was overseeing more directly the Battle of Stalingrad. But Stalin keeps pushing for, you really need to open up a Western front. Like, we're fighting on the Eastern Front, wearing ourselves out. It's this devastatingly brutal conflict, and you guys need to invade from the West. And honestly, it pains me to agree with Stalin about anything, but, they did need that extra force. They needed to get Germany sandwiched, but we were not yet confident in our ability to do that just yet. We thought we needed to kind of soften them up by taking, Italy out of the fight and some other things first. So Roosevelt Roosevelt and Churchill wanted to delay opening a Western front, but they thought they could accomplish some things in the short run. So what they wanted to do is invade through Italy, which they considered to be kind of, Churchill used the phrase, the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. Now, Churchill also, at one point in World War I, if you remember, he believed that the Ottoman Empire was the soft underbelly of the Central Powers in that war, commanded troops at the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, and is defeated by troops under Mustafa Kemal, who becomes the Turkish president, Ataturk. But in World War II, they again it's funny how many things circle back around in this thing. Churchill says, let's invade from the south. Then, so they decide to invade Italy. Now, Italy is a country that it's in a really bad position as far as defending against an invasion, because that little boot shape that they're sticking out into the water, they've got coastline down the entire country. I mean, you can invade any part of Italy from the coast. So that's a difficult position for the Italians to be in. But then the question becomes, where do we attack? And so we do some kind of diversionary stuff. Ultimately, we're going to start off by taking the island of Sicily, just south of the mainland of Italy, in a battle that's called Operation Husky. We had 3,000 ships. Were involved. Ultimately, they forced the Germans off the island, defeat the Italians, and Sicily became an Allied base. Then we had a general by the name of Mark Clark was in charge. Battles at Salerno, at Anzio, and we're fighting a combination of Italian and German troops. Probably more German troops than Italian troops, to be honest. So we start to kind of push toward Rome, face some stiff resistance. Allies finally march into Rome on June 4th of 1944. The Romans actually kind of cheered the Allied victory. They looked at it as a deliverance. Mussolini was becoming unpopular. People were kind of starting to kind of see that this fascism thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. So 1944, Italy really gets knocked out of the war. Mussolini gets deposed. The new government actually re-enters the war on the side of the Allies. So the Italians actually briefly switch sides when all is said and done. However, once they got into northern Italy, they found out that really it was a tougher fight than they expected. The German resistance in northern Italy was very strong, so it took a long time. But finally, they crossed the Alps. Let's see, if it had a particular time. It doesn't say a particular time, but towards the late 44, they finally kind of have the Germans pushed out of Italy. Interesting footnote about the Battle of Sicily. Now, I'm trying to reconstruct this from memory from something I remember from college, and that's been, 15 years now, as weird as that is to say. But if I recall correctly, the story of how this all went down, I know I have the general story, right? I might mess up a detail here or there, but the crazy thing about the Sicily invasion, the Italians kind of, they had kind of figured that we were going to invade, but the question was where. And so we actually had I'm thinking this is before the Sicily invasion. I don't think it was in France. Yeah, I think it was before Sicily. So what we did, we actually got the body of an enemy soldier, I think this is a plot of, I think it was, either military intelligence or the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA. So they, so they got the body of an enemy soldier. They put him in American uniform, and they literally washed his body up on a beach with forged documents, pretending to have the secret plan for where we were going to invade Italy. And it got the Axis troops to like dedicate their troops to like guarding the wrong spot. So the place that we actually invaded was relatively open. And so like they faked this, like they leaked this sort of fake information that someone stumbles upon and says, "Oh my God, we've hit pay dirt. We've gotten the secret of where the Allies are invading." And the whole time we're sitting there laughing because we completely set them up to fake them out of their shoes. So that was a pretty cool activity by the American intelligence. If I recall all the details of that story correctly, but anyway, so this is going to lead us to the next phase of the war we'll look at here. We'll actually look at what happens when we invade France. So see you in a minute.